month. It had always seemed impregnable with its giant cannons and the network of tunnels under Malinta Hill where no bomb could reach. But under constant Japanese attack from land, sea and air, even Corregidor fell. There was no more resistance in the Philippines when the men of Corregidor surrendered. It was not the only loss to the United States in the Western Pacific. Guam and Wake Islands had been taken too, but the Philippines was the major prize. In Tokyo, the crowds were ecstatic. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines. Within a fortnight, they were to hear also of the fall of Burma. A resounding banzai echoed round the empire. General Tojo himself joined in the exultation, and the emperor came forth to greet his people. But in the United States, plans for revenge had already begun. Even before the fall of Corregidor, the Americans conceived an attempt to bring the war home to the Japanese. A crazy idea to bomb Tokyo, 10,000 miles from the United States coast. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was given the task of training a squadron of B-25 Mitchell twin-engine bombers to take off from an aircraft carrier deck only 90 yards long. And Vice Admiral Halsey was ordered to take 16 of these planes across the Pacific to within striking distance of the Japanese capital. But in mid-Pacific, the plan was spoiled. A Japanese trawler sighted the American aircraft carrier 2 days before it reached the planned strike position. The trawler was sunk, but Halsey, fearing it may have alerted the Japanese fleet, ordered the B-25s to take off. Pilots knew as they got airborne that they could not return to the carrier. Their only hope after bombing Tokyo was for a safe landing in China. But no one had alerted the Japanese. In Tokyo, it was the Emperor's birthday. The sky was full of planes. Doolittle's raiders flew over Tokyo for some 30 seconds, dropped a total of 16 tons of bombs. Then they fled to China. Doolittle remembers.
One airplane against orders flew to Russia. He had a leak in his gas tank, and he flew to Vladivostok because he felt he could not possibly get to China. The other airplanes, the other 15, all proceeded to China. 2 of them cracked up on the coast of China, just about out of gasoline, and by the time we got to China, the weather was again very bad. One of them cracked up on a lake in the interior. The rest of us jumped. So our airplanes were all lost. All 16 of the airplanes were lost.
3 of Doolittle's raiders, as they were called in the newspapers, were captured by the Japanese and later executed for war crimes.
I felt very badly indeed. I had lost all of my aircraft. My crews were widely dispersed, and I think I have never felt sadder or less successful than I did after the Tokyo raid.
Nevertheless, 77 men survived the raid. They were given a triumphant welcome in China by Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
On the other hand, the raid did have two desirable results. One is it caused the Japanese people to question their warlords, who had told them that Japan would never be bombed. Two, it gave the folks at home the first good news that they had had. All news prior to that had been unfavorable.
The Doolittle raid was important, not simply because it caused the Japanese people to question their military leaders. It also strengthened Admiral Yamamoto's argument that if Japan was to be defended against such raids, the United States fleet would have to be defeated, and Japan would have to capture Midway. But this was not yet the concern of the Japanese. Their eyes still looked to the south and the rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies.
These were now secured by a series of lightning raids which took Borneo, the Celebes, Java, and Sumatra. But now, the Japanese advance slowed down. In New Guinea, the Australians stuck it out in the dense jungle. They were helped by the local natives, and the Japanese found it hard going. Slowly, the Australians fell back, climbing the central mountain range up the Kokoda Track, a jungle trail which would get them to Port Moresby on the southern side of the island. The Japanese needed to take Port Moresby, but they could not get up the Kokoda Track. Port Moresby was never captured. It was to prove to be a crucial factor in the war in the Pacific. Ever since the beginning of hostilities, Australia had been within the range of the Japanese bombers, operating either from aircraft carriers or from air bases in the southern territories that the Japanese captured. And even before MacArthur had left the Philippines to set up his base in Australia, the Japanese had bombed Darwin on the northern coast on the 19th of February with a total of 242 bombers. This raid had sunk several ships, including the United States destroyer Peary, as well as killing over 200 civilians.
But the Japanese knew that if they were to seriously hamper the Americans' lines of communication with MacArthur's forces, they would have to control the seas immediately to the north of Australia, and this meant that they needed to capture Port Moresby. It was now becoming obvious that this would be very difficult to take by land, and so a naval assault was prepared. The invasion forces assembled on the 4th of May 1942 and sailed south from Rabaul into the Coral Sea. But here the Americans were ready. Alerted by their decoding experts, they had moved two aircraft carriers, the Yorktown and Lexington, into the Coral Sea. On the 7th of May, a reconnaissance plane from the Yorktown sighted the Japanese forces. The American planes took off to fight the Japanese ships beyond the horizon. It was to be the first naval battle in history where the opposing commanders could not see the enemy. It was also to be the first time that the Japanese fleet felt the strength of an American carrier-borne strike. As the American torpedo bombers approached the Japanese, the weather worsened. One of the Japanese carriers, the Zuikaku, was completely obscured by the storm. So the other Japanese carrier, Shakaku, became the main target for the American planes. It was put out of action. But the planes from the Zuikaku had been launched at the height of the storm. Now they found the American fleet in bright sunshine under blue skies. The Yorktown was hit and seemed on the point of sinking. The Lexington was hit, was blown up by its own arsenal and sunk. The Japanese withdrew and turned their attention to Midway. Yamamoto put together the largest fleet in the world.
The Americans, already aware of Yamamoto's plans because they could now decode any Japanese radio signal, called every ship they could to this decisive battle. The severely damaged Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor. Engineers estimated it would take them 3 months to repair it. Admiral Nimitz gave them 2 days. Somehow, the Yorktown was made seaworthy in time. It meant that the Americans could put 3 aircraft carriers into the battle: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. The Americans also had Midway itself. Here, from a small landing strip, flying fortresses could take off. It was a squadron of these flying fortresses on a reconnaissance mission that first spotted the Japanese fleet. As the bombs dropped, the alert was sounded on both sides. It was June the 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway was about to begin. The Japanese made the first move. Within 15 minutes, 108 planes were in the skies. The Americans were ready. They sent off a first wave of fighters to defend the island.